preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Thank you very much, and I have to say at this point that I'm glad you all made it. We were lucky that the William Kennedy Smith trial was over early tonight, I guess, but we'll talk more about that later. Yes, I'm here tonight, as Melissa said, to talk about re-victimization of female crime victims especially in our media and in our courtrooms. There is a definite climate of violence against women in our country, and it trickles down through the press and into the courtrooms with a prevailing attitude of blame the victim, especially female victims, for their own misfortune, whether it be rape or murder, assault, whatever. We're seeing that right now, and I have a feeling we'll have a very hot question and answer period after that. But let me start with my story, because I think that in the case of what we went through as a family and what I went through, what happened to Jennifer after her death is a very telling story of how our justice system and the media can take tragedy and make it worse. As many of you must know that my daughter was murdered in 1986 by Robert Chambers. Let me say that there's nothing in this life that prepares one for the murder of a child. So I can only tell you that it's a shock to be in that position when you have to bury a child, and then to add to that, in our case specifically, the media coverage that followed it, which was relentless, which was a complete invasion of privacy to myself and my family, where we did not have 1 minute to probably even absorb or mourn the death of our daughter without constant phone calls and buzzers ringing and people invading our privacy wherever we went. We couldn't even leave the apartment house without being followed by the press. This is an issue that I speak a lot about and I'm very concerned with. It's the First Amendment issue, which I want to mention at this point. Another thing happened in the Supreme Court today. I just heard the ruling on the Son of Sam law, which is upholding the First Amendment right for criminals to be able to tell their story and profit from it. Up till now, we were protected by the David Berkowitz case called the Son of Sam law. And in other words, when somebody wrote a book, they can do and say what they want. They do have freedom of speech. They just can't profit from it. And the proceeds would go to the victim's crime board, which would go back to the victim. Now, unfortunately, it was unanimously overturned in the Supreme Court, and this means that anyone, I see them lining up tomorrow with the publishers on one end and the criminals on the other in prison tomorrow, not to mention the sickos that may be out there thinking, gee, you know, if I kill 12 or 13 people, I'll tell my story and my family will prosper, and who cares what happens to me. So it's a really scary decision that was handed down, and if anyone's interested in getting involved, I have some brochures around somewhere. My organization will be fighting to either reword the bill so that it will be repassed, or just lobby against what the decision was and see what we can do about it. The problem with giving all of these rights to the criminal and all of these perks to the criminal is, yes, the Constitution does protect them, and it's good that they have rights. I think that the defendants need to have rights in court, but the sad part of it is that the victims have absolutely no rights. They never had, and I'm just now beginning to feel from the public and the public awareness with television and the courtroom trial and things that are happening, that we're starting to see that the victims are really the forgotten people in the courtroom. They're the orphans. And most cases, I know for myself and my family, when we went into court, you're under the misconception that the prosecutor who was prosecuting the case, in our case, Linda Fairstein, who was excellent, is there for you, and she's there for your daughter. But she's not. She's representing the state of New York, and you are not entitled to legal counsel as a victim or as a homicide survivor, as we call ourselves. And this is, one thing that is really very unbalanced for people who go into a situation like that, as we did, in a state of shock, not knowing what to expect from the courtroom, not knowing what to expect from the press, not knowing how to handle people that wanted interviews from us, not knowing that we had the right to say we don't want to speak, instead of standing there mute or running away crying because we couldn't handle the intrusion. I think that's something that really should be looked at in our system. I don't believe we should take any rights away from the defendants, but I really believe we should bring some of the victims' rights into focus and some of their issues that really badly need attention. In our case, what happened along the line after the terrible invasion of privacy that didn't stop for 2 years was Robert Chambers told a story that was based on made-for-headline items. Rough sex, she tried to rape me, underage drinking, Central Park, middle-class white kids. This was what the media thrives on, and they certainly did, and they did a very good job keeping it in the headlines for almost 2 years on and off until the trial was over. We found out, again, we have no rights to even some of the things that were being said about the family. The New York Times has a habit of taking the blame off of the criminal and putting it on society. Well, maybe if the family paid more attention to their child, she wouldn't be dead. This is an awful thing to have to live with when you've lost a loved one, and the worst thing that could happen to a parent, you feel the guilt. You feel, my God, maybe I have failed as a parent, and that's why she's dead. This is natural for somebody who goes through a violent crime like this. And to make it worse, you've got the press accusing you of doing something awful when, in fact, there was really nothing that you could do. But the what-ifs of your life could drive you crazy when you're in a state of shock. I think the worst thing that happened, beside the death of my daughter during the trial, was what was known as the diary decision. And that came about to give you an idea how defense attorneys can use tactics like this, which are the blame the victim tactics. He did get a perfect client in Robert Chambers, because Jack Lippman, the defense attorney, is known to slander the victim. He did this in the Richard Herron case about 11 years ago, which at that time was the Yale murder case. Of course, this is now the Preppy murder case. The press loves to dub titles onto all of these cases. But he defended a young man who took a sledgehammer and beat his girlfriend's head in. And he was up for, he confessed, by the way, to a priest, and he was up on murder charges, naturally. And Jack Lippman, 11 years ago, was able to convince a jury, which is a whole other story, that he was in an extremely emotionally disturbed state when he did it, because she told him she didn't love him anymore. So he got off on a manslaughter charge. He's serving time in prison, but not as much as he should be. The jury actually believed that somebody would smash someone's head in with a hammer because she didn't love him anymore, and it was okay. So our case was really custom-made for Jack Lippman. Here's the story that Robert Chambers saying she tried to have her way with me. She was aggressive. She was crazed. And he took everything that he could out of that confession and he fed it to the press. And it's very nice that they both can work together so nicely, which is really what happens in cases like this. The press is dying for headlines. The family won't talk to the press. So they get their headlines where they can, and it's usually from the defense attorneys. When it came to this so-called sex diary issue, what really had happened is that when Jennifer's body was found, the police came to my ex-husband's loft where Jennifer was living and asked Steve, my ex-husband, if he has anything that has names and addresses of her friends in it. And he was in a state of shock, but they went into her room and he picked up an appointment book, which is a spiral day-at-a-glance appointment book, that in the front she had listed all of the friends with the names and numbers, and she had many, hundreds. And the police took it and thinking that could help track down the killer. Well, 12 hours later, Robert Chambers confessed, and the book was given back to Linda Fairstein, and Linda looked at it, and it was an appointment book of a young girl, school appointments and lunch appointments, and she gave it back to Steve. During the discovery, or the pretrial, where each side can ask for certain things from the other as evidences, Jack Lippman made a motion in court, which he knew would be in the press the next day, and he worded it so, to see the sex diary of Jennifer Levins that chronicled her sexual activities before she had met Robert Chambers and possibly during her relationship with Robert Chambers. In case the press didn't pick it up, he called the press room, we found out afterwards, to feed them the headline. And the next day, as the wounded family that we were, we see the headlines because they were hard to miss. Jenny keeps a sex diary. And it put us further into a horrible state of despair. I mean, you have to understand, we weren't in an emotional condition to try to even defend what they were saying about Jennifer, nor should we have had to. She was murdered, and yet they were murdering my daughter twice. And I felt more helpless than I would normally feel, or anyone under these circumstances, to know there was absolutely nothing that I could do about it. When we saw that in the paper, we called Linda Fairstein, again, she's our lawyer? Wrong. She's not our lawyer. She was very upset, though, as well. And she said, it's up to you what you want to do. She said, you have the book. He's going to want to see it. Make your decision. Well, we met as a family. And we decided that whatever we had to do, we had to stop being helpless, because you are in such a helpless position. There's absolutely nothing that you can do legally or otherwise to stop this process. It keeps mushrooming like a horrible cloud over your head. So we decided that we would keep this book and not hand it over under any circumstances. And sure enough, on Thanksgiving Eve, Jack Lipman was kind enough as a Thanksgiving gift to subpoena my ex-husband and his wife for the so-called diary. And then we met again, and we had to make a decision. We had to decide if we were going to hand over this book, which was really a very benign book and would have showed him right away that there was nothing in it, or were we, at our first chance, the first opportunity that we have had since my daughter was killed, stand firm and in her name and in her memory not allow him to pour through anything of hers, and not allow her murderer to pour through it. And we decided that's what we would do. If anything else, it empowered us to do something. It meant hiring our own lawyer at a great expense. And he did go to court, and he fought the subpoena. 6 weeks it took. Jack Lipman was like a pit bull. He bit into an issue, and he would not let go. And of course, while it was being fought in court, he was making sure that the headlines would be that the sex diary, the sex diary, the sex diary. Well, finally, after a long fight, Judge Bell said that he would like to read the diary in question in his chambers, in camera, and come back and make a decision whether it was relevant or not. And we had to decide if we wanted him to do that, but of course we did decide, because we knew he would find it irrelevant. So he went into his chambers for 4 hours. He read the book cover to cover, I assume. He came back and said, in a typical Judge Bell way, because he was not the swiftest judge, I'll make a decision on this in 4 weeks. And he did. It took him 4 weeks, and he came back, and he went on a bench, and he stood up, and he said something he could have said then. He said, I find nothing, absolutely nothing relevant in this diary that has anything to do with Robert Chambers, Jennifer's sex life, or anything else, and certainly not admissible in this case. End of story. It put us through 10 weeks of agony, worse agony than we were in, because now we had a decision that we were fighting, and felt that this was something that perhaps would give us the power to do something for our daughter. And we're very happy that it turned out that way, but it took its toll on all of us. And that was just the beginning of the trial. Of course, when the trial came, we did have a 12-week trial. And as a victim sitting in a courtroom, I call myself a victim. Really, I'm a survivor, so I think I'll use that term. It's a better term to use. We sat there as a spectator. I mean, we were allowed in the courtroom, which was very nice. You're not always allowed in, even the family of victims. But we were allowed to sit there, and we sat for 12 weeks to, in my feeling was, to represent our daughter. This was told to me by Dominic Dunn, who befriended me, and when I said to him, how did you go to the trial every day? He said, I felt, and you should feel this way, that you must do this for your daughter. It's the last bit of business that you must take care of for her, to be there to represent her. Because all I could imagine is, how do you sit in a room with Robert Chambers? And that was just part of it. I mean, that was bad enough. On top of that, we had the curiosity seekers. We had crowds of lunatics running around there. There were some beauties sitting in the trial every day. I understand that they're there as court groupies all the time. But they were kind of the light end of it. On the other end of it, of course, you're sitting there with the court sketch artists, who make no bones about turning around in their seat completely around and staring at you all through the trial to capture every expression you make. It's a very uncomfortable feeling, very unnerving. And you've got the judge, and you've got the defense attorneys, and you've got his family, and you've got him. And there was a point, I'm going to share this little story with you. I have shared this with other people going through trials, and I certainly don't recommend that you do this unless it's an extreme case, but in my case it was. How did I sit with Robert Chambers in the courtroom for 12 weeks? Everyone asked me, and this is what I did, truthfully. We had to behave ourselves. If we broke down and cried, we'd be barred from the courtroom. If we got up and shouted, we'd be barred. So it was very difficult and frustrating to sit there and watch what has nothing to do with justice, just smoke screening going on, which you're probably seeing in the Kennedy trial now, and have to sit there and know that our daughter was killed, and all of this is to try to make this little boy, this white, lily white altar boy, looked like he was an accident. He didn't mean to do it. So what I would do is I'd concentrate on the back of his head, which was all I could see. And I'd visualize a bullet going from my eyeball right to the back of his head, and then his head exploding like a melon. And I'd actually start to think, after I did this day after day, that he must be feeling something, because he kept on scratching the back of his head. And I started feeling it was having an effect, even if it was just giving him a headache. Something I was doing was working. I've told that to a couple of people who've had to sit through trials like that, and I've been thanked twice for that method. This method acting or method visualization seems to work. By the way, just as a side note, Robert Chambers is up for parole in December of 1992. And we're hoping that he won't get out, and we're going to have probably around June a big letter writing and petition campaign to keep him in. But again, you know, for Robert Chambers or any murderer, especially with the kind of sentencing they hand out today, if he doesn't get out this time around, which is only 5 years, he is eligible for parole every 2 years. So for a family like us to have to worry and wonder if he's getting out sooner than he deserves to get out, we're living a lifelong sentence as it is. But you know, one day he's going to be on the street again, and it's a horrible thing to live with, because you know it just brings up all the frustrations and angers inside you. When I have to go and visit my daughter in the cemetery, and I know that this person is going to continue a life one day as a fairly young man. So if anyone wants to get involved with those letters and petitions, I have information on that as well. Getting back to the tactics that the defense attorney uses and women victims and this blame the victim tactic, it's a very insidious thing, because to be honest with you, and I don't think there has been a time where any of us, one time or another in our lives, has not somehow, some way, had a little bit of question about the victim and their ethics or their judgment. Or, for instance, well, I wouldn't be in the park at that hour, or I wouldn't be jogging at that hour, or I wouldn't go back to his house and have a drink with him at that hour. This is something that we all do, which is really a form of distancing ourselves from the victim. And women, by the way, are the worst offenders of this, because it's the woman who sees a rape victim or a woman murder victim and says, what, the mindset is, what did she do that I would never do? This is a protection. And the further we can distance ourselves away from the victim, the easier it is for us to deal with a crime like this happening. It's a very sad thing to do. I think it's come time when we see what's happening with the crime rate, we see how random crime is. We really have to reach out and embrace our victims and not put that stigma on the rape victim or the murder victim or any female in court that may have been wearing the wrong clothes or may not have been at the right time in the right place. Or usually it's just being with the wrong person in the wrong place, and it's certainly not person's fault that they got raped or murdered, in most cases, and there are always exceptions to the rule. But I'm saying in general, the blame the victim is perpetrated by the press and the defense attorneys because the public is so willing to buy it. And you know, I'm here and I've talked to a lot of people about that, and it's really time that we stop doing that and we embrace it, because any of us here sitting here now can be the next victim. I believe that it should be an embracing situation, and we should care a lot about the people that are victims of crime, and rather than putting distance between them. It's interesting too that they don't use this tactic unless the person, the defendant is well-groomed, white, looks well. They can't use that, because if he looked cruddy and he was awful looking, they would say, he's definitely a killer. But when they dress him up and put a tie on him and cut his hair and put him into court, the idea is, how can a guy like this do something like that? Well, there are lots of psychopaths walking around in this world. I mean, Chambers is just one of them. I don't know if Willie Smith is another, but we've got the Bundys of the world, and they're all over the place. And they're hard to recognize, and it's a scary thing. As a matter of fact, getting back to the blame the victim, Linda Fairstein told me something that amazed me, but I found out through my own experience, because I've sat in on a lot of trials, and I've talked to a lot of people, that the worst people to have on a rape jury, the worst gender, is women. And whenever she picks juries for rape juries, she tries to get as few women as possible, because they always sit there and they say, what did she do to ask for this? He's such a nice boy. I have a son like that. It looks like he can go on with his life. I mean, this one must have done something really hard, or she must be a really tough cookie. And it's terrible to think that we're our own worst enemies, us women, who have to be sticking together in our sisterhood. But it does work like that, and it really shouldn't. I think we should all, just being made aware of it, maybe the next time you hear something like this, you'll think twice about it. And society as a whole, not just women, do distance themselves from victims, but I find it really awful that it's the women who are the worst of it. of our kind. At this point, I'm going to tell you a story that is very, I think, revealing about why it's important to embrace our victims, to pay attention to what's happening to them and to our public safety laws and everything in our city. When Linda Fairstein was investigating this case, she tried to call in as many kids that were in Dorrian's that night as possible. And the kids were very willing to come in and testify. I mean, not even testify, just talk to her in her office. That's all she wanted. It was the parents who were objected to their kids getting involved. And she said in her life she never had a worse time trying to convince people to come in and help with a case in her life than she did with the parents of these children. One parent in particular, she quoted as being the rudest of them all. He was a doctor here on the Upper East Side. His son Peter was very close to Robert Chambers. He was in Dorrian's that night. He was very involved with the situation, according to the eyewitnesses, that he was with them when they were talking, and he was an integral part of the investigation. And she called and she called and she called, and he would not return her phone call. So she finally called his father, who she found out was a leading psychiatrist here in the city. And when she did get him on the phone, she said, "I appeal to you, please let me talk to your son. He's not returning my calls. It's very important that he comes and just talks to me." And he said, "I'm sorry, Miss Fairstein, but I am a very famous doctor with a very famous name. I do not want my son or my name to be associated with just a sordid case, and I refuse to be involved with it." And she said, "Excuse me, but you are a psychiatrist. I would think that you know about passion and compassion for people. How could you say that? A young girl is dead. I'm trying to see that justice is done here." He said, "I'm sorry, but we will not cooperate." And he hung up the phone. On April 17th of this year, that very same doctor, Dr. Capsnell, was walking back from a concert here on 92nd Street. And he was hit over the head many times by a mugger with a 2x4. He went into a coma for 24 hours and finally died. And his wife was quoted in the paper saying, "How could something like this happen to people like us?" And this is one of the reasons why it's so important for all of us to help each other out when we have this situation. On a little lighter note, what I've been doing, I guess Melissa told you pretty much what I've been working on. I did form a committee. I'm writing a book. The book is going slowly because I've had some problems with my publisher. They wanted me to tell my story, but when I started telling it, they didn't like what I was saying. Not how I was saying it, they just didn't want me to put a few things in the book that I felt, what's the sense in writing a book? So when they gave me a hard time, I put the book aside and I said, "You know something, I'll regress into another depression, suicidal state, which I was in when this happened. I'm going to pull myself together and march up to Albany and do something in person to get laws changed." And that's basically what I did. Again, the anger took over, and I got a group together called Justice for All with another group. We're all survivors of homicide, most of us anyway. We're all very emotional people. None of us are great business people, so we're a very poor committee, but we are passionate, and we started going up to Albany to fight for some rights for victims. And right at the beginning of the inception of our group, Robert Abrams called me, and he said that he is working on a bill that would further protect rape victims. Right now there's a rape shield bill that exists to protect the rape victims from having their past in court, their sexual past in court. This bill is an outcome of my case and that of Marla Hanson, whose face was slashed, and yet the defense attorney was able to bring up the fact she was an abused child and other horrible things about her that had nothing to do with her attack. As a result, they worded the bill that would extend the Rape Shield Act to cover deceased victims and victims of non-sexual crimes like Marla. Well, they sent the bill to me to approve it, and I changed a few words around. I felt very good about that. I sent it back, and they put the bill through, and we went up to lobby, Marla and I, and a few other people from my group, and we were received very well. I don't know what they were saying behind our backs because they're politicians, but they liked us being there, and they were very friendly. As it turned out, we worked very hard towards the end of the session because naturally they were caught up in budget problems. We saw a lot of people, and we got the bill passed. It was signed into law last year by Mario Cuomo. And we're very proud of that, except you must realize it's just the tip of the iceberg, because most of the damage that gets done to victims, their sexual past or otherwise, is done way before the trial. It's done in the press, It's done in the pretrial motions. It's done before a jury even gets there, so that the jury has already formed an opinion from what they've read in the paper or heard on television. But it is something. In this case, it will protect a victim, a deceased victim or a non-sexual crime victim from anything coming up in court, which before that wasn't. The reason that this is so important to me is that during this diary debate, Jack Littman stood in court when we were fighting for Jennifer's rights to privacy, and he made a comment that really triggered me into action. And he stood up and he said, Jennifer Levin lost her constitutional rights the day she died. Meaning she did. She lost. I mean, there's no law that says you lose your rights, but there's no law that says that you have your rights. So in essence, what he was saying was, she's fair game. We could not sue him for slander. We could not, the estate of Jennifer could not sue him for slander. He was just free to do whatever he wanted with her memory, and if he wanted her possessions. I mean, he could have kept subpoenaing us for anything that he wanted to see, and unless we hired lawyers to fight it in court, he was entitled to see that, because she lost her rights when she died, and I think that that's what turned me into a crazy person. I just, as sick and sad as I was over the whole thing, at that point I said something is very wrong in the system. And when I get better, I'm going to do something about it. One of the issues we're working on now, which is very timely with what we're seeing with the Kennedy trial, is the cameras in the courtroom issue. I have very, very mixed feelings about this. Albany has very mixed feelings about it. We have had cameras in the courtroom for several years, but it's what they call the trial bill. And if it was not approved last year, it was canceled. And it wasn't approved mainly because my group went up there and testified that there were a lot of things that the cameras in the courtroom were doing that were not kosher. One of those things were they were focusing the cameras on the families in the audience, especially moments when the mother would start crying or, and I've seen this personally. They're not supposed to be doing that, but they were. We also felt that there should be a automatic protection, if they wanted, for witnesses and for victims, not to be on camera. I mean, it's a grueling thing to take the stand. You saw what this poor rape victim went through. Rape victims are always protected, but not so with any other victim. And I'm talking about incest, child abuse, domestic violence victims. I mean, these are people that will be televised if the judge decides it. And we believe that they have a right to not be televised if they want. And this caused a big stir in the Assembly and the Senate, and they fought back and forth, and they couldn't reach a decision. So by the end of the session, bingo, the law died, and there are no cameras in the courtroom now. But it is coming up again this year, and maybe when we get through our question and answer session, I can get people's opinion on how they feel about it from what's going on, because I have mixed feelings now. I don't know that we should have them at all. This is how I'm starting to think, so maybe we'll get to that later. Basically, what my group does beside the lobby work and the political work is we really do a lot of educating as to what the public can do to get involved to stop some of these practices from happening, or at least, give the democracy back to the people, where you can actually have a say in our justice system. Most people don't realize that. You can, all of us, any of us, write a letter to a judge pre-sentence before he sentences a criminal, after the jury's come in with a verdict. And you can say, this is a heinous crime, and this criminal is awful, and he deserves to spend the maximum in jail, and send it to the judge. And if he gets 100, 200, 300 letters, which happens very often now, thanks to the efforts of people like me and other victims advocates who work for things like this, he does take that into consideration. I mean, the last thing he wants to do is go against what the community would like. Same thing with parole. When somebody's coming up for parole that you know about, which is the best kept secret in New York. I mean, you never know when someone's coming up for parole, but there are ways that we find out. We could all write letters. We do that. We sent a petition up. Marla Hanson Slasher was up for parole in June, and we got a petition together with 6,000 signatures on it, and that guy did not get out. So that's another way you can get involved. I mean, it feels good to have a voice when you sit back and you say, what can I do? These are some of the things you can do to get involved. Another thing, I guess, is probably the obvious, and I don't want to get too involved with this because this gets into the psychology of it all. But there is, as far as women and men go in this country, I guess we're all pretty much aware that there is two different mindsets happening here. I truly believe that William Kennedy Smith believes he was entitled to whatever happened. And I think that is the general attitude of most young men in our country. And it's unfortunate because I think it's the age of innocence for our daughters and for our youngsters in general. I think it's time for them to be aware that they can be put into compromising positions that they would not ordinarily think of, that it's not a perfect world, and there are situations which are not safe for them to be in, especially with the psychopaths out there, especially with what we're seeing now and how the blame the victim tactic works against them. It's going to prohibit other victims from even reporting rapes, and this is my big fear with this whole case. So I think it's important to warn our children, or try to educate them, that it is the end of innocence in a way, and it's sad, but it at least may save their lives. So I would suggest that they pay attention to what's happening. As far as what we're facing in the future, our crime rate is awful, and it's rising. 1 out of every 4 of you will be a victim of violent crime in your lifetime. There is a person murdered in the United States every 25 minutes. And well, I've been talking about 40 minutes now. There have been 7 rapes since I've been talking in this country, and probably 1 is going on right now. So none of us are immune to what's happening. The best thing that I can say is if you can't prevent the crime from happening, which is some of the things we're trying to do as well, at least get involved and voice your opinion to stop coddling the defendant and start to get heavy with our crime prevention laws, get heavy with our gun control laws, get heavy with treating the victim with dignity and respect that they deserve, and let the defendant be protected by the Constitution, but let us get some rights too, because it's not until people who aren't yet victims of crime are as outraged as those who are that change is going to be made. So I hope you'll all get involved. Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know if we need the lights, if we want to take some questions. Oh, good. Yes, go ahead.
Mrs. Levin, I just want to thank you for getting the rape shield law extended. Would you favor provision to disbar lawyers like Levin or Aldermanics or Perislotic who use victim blaming techniques?
I'll tell you a little story about that. He wants to know, he was happy that we got the rape shield extension bill passed. He asked if we could take steps, or we'd be interested in taking steps to disbar lawyers like Lippman and Slotnick that use the blame the victim defense. Here's a little story to tell you just how not easy that is. We had a very famous and wonderful victims' rights lawyer. He's probably the most famous in the country. His name's Frank Carrington. Contact us when this trial was going on, and flew to New York to meet with my father and I, because what he was compiling in Virginia, where he was from, was a dossier on Lippman like this of all the things that he was doing that were totally unethical. And he had said, I know you're in no condition to instill lawsuits or get anything instigated right now with the condition you're in, but please consider when this trial is over, I have a very good feeling that you can slap a lawsuit on Lippman for extreme emotional distress. Same thing he let a guy get through with. He feels that what he did to us as a family was he unnecessarily caused us distress, and he did. So the job he gave my dad, which my dad pursued very vigorously, was to find, he's not licensed in New York, Frank Carrington. He said, find a New York lawyer who will work with me and will at least get disciplinary actions against this guy. Well, my dad must have called 35 or 40 law firms, and not one lawyer would take on the case. I don't think, since lawyers protect lawyers, and since lawyers govern what other lawyers do, and since there is no judicial body that governs what lawyers say, think, or do, I think we're pretty much at their mercy. Unless, everybody gets angry enough that we should start showing up at trials like I've been doing and watching what their tactics are. I have known that a few defense attorneys in my presence have cringed a little bit when they may be about to get nasty or something. But I don't know. I can't be at every trial, and none of us can. It's a shame that these practices exist. Any more questions? Yeah.
I was curious how you felt about Channel 4 and New York Times divulging the name of the victim.
Oh, I thought it was awful. As a matter of fact, I wrote to them and I complained to them, and they wrote me back and apologized and said that they already changed their policy because even in their infrastructure there were so many complaints about what happened. But that's another clear example of doing something that not only isn't right, it's not even legal, and getting away with it, because I'm sure that, well, maybe the victim, if she wanted to, she could sue, but that's the last thing that's on her mind right now, I'm sure. But no, they got plenty of complaints about that, and I think it's awful that they do that. And yet, on the other side of that, by the way, the rape victims that do come forward and that want their name told should be allowed to do that. I mean, there are plenty of people that feel that if they made their case, a public case, and they could come forward and talk about it, that would be helpful. So I think it should always be up to the victim how to handle that. Yes?
Are you going to try and take your laws national to Congress?
Well, we are now in 3 states, Justice for All, and it looks like we're headed to be a national PAC. It's a lot of work, and we're very under budgeted.
Field law, you're going to try and take it to.
Yeah, we've had a couple of people writing us from other state governments inquiring about the things that we're working on, and we exchange a lot of material back and forth, and we've offered to go and work with them on various legislations. But it'll be a long process. Right now, the biggest thing that we're working on, which is becoming a national thing, is Victims' Constitutional Amendment. And this is something that drives lawyers crazy. I mean, the first thing that they do is they freeze when you say a constitutional amendment. But basically, it's really very simple, and it's not asking for much. It's only asking that victims have the right to be present at, to be heard from, and to be notified at every step of the judicial process. That does not exist today. There is no law that says we have to be notified about anything, and we're usually the last to know. It's been passed in 8 states. If 3/4 of the states in the United States pass it, it can become an actual amendment. But we're trying to get it passed just here in New York, and we're having an awful time. It's been 2 years that we've been lobbying for it, and nobody wants to hear it. Well, I shouldn't say that. This year, we got 68 supporters in the Assembly, and that's an amazing number for any victims bill, because the Assembly notoriously is Democratic, and they're all defense attorneys. So, any other questions?
What are the 8 states?
Pardon?
What are the 8 states?
Well, I can name a few of them. I know Arizona and Florida and California. I think Michigan. I don't have my notes in front of me. Those are the 4, but if you wanted to call me, I can give you the rest of them from home.
Did you have any feeling about the judge in relationship to the kind of trial you had, changes that?
Yeah, I think that as a matter of fact, I think they changed the law. Our judge was picked by the wheel system. And because he was so inept at handling such a high-profile case, since then they have hand-selected judges for such high-profile cases. The poor guy, I kind of felt sorry for him afterwards. In hindsight, I feel sorry for him. Then I just thought, get rid of this guy. He was totally intimidated by Jack Littman, which is not hard to do. Jack Littman is a very imposing and crazed person in the courtroom, and it became Jack Littman's courtroom. It wasn't the judge's courtroom. There was no controlling him. And I think there were more sidebars in our case. Somebody did a study when the trial was over than in any other case in New York. Not to mention that it was a 12-week case and it was a 9-day deliberation. Jack Littman just was on his feet every other word, objecting to everything that was said from the prosecutor's mouth. And the judge just allowed everything. So it's unfortunate that we got stuck with the judge, and I'm sure it didn't do much for his career either, so. Yes?
Why didn't you join with the Van Bulow Children's Organization?
I am.
Oh, okay.
I am. Well, you see, there's a difference. We're the only political action committee for victims, I think, in the country. The Sonny Van Bulow, which is called the National Victims Center, is really a clearinghouse for all the victims groups, but they can't get politically involved because they're under a non-for-profit chapter, and that restricts them. So we actually do their politics for them. So we are very much involved. Anyone else? Yes?
Is there any kind of a guidebook or handbook that can be distributed to survivors in the trial situation? I'm a homicide survivor also, and we went through 2 trials over 2 years, and ultimately the boy was acquitted because he was murdered by the boyfriend. We had no idea what we could and couldn't do. We only knew.
Nobody does.
The prosecution told us, sit there, don't say a word, don't cry, don't look at muscle, don't look fake. And very much the same sort of yours. We would have liked to have an advocate. Is there any kind of?
Well, there's something that the district attorney's office is supposed to hand to all victims of crime, which is very rarely done. They blame it on busy schedules and they don't have the time. And it's terrible because as a victim, you are totally alone and helpless and vulnerable, and there's nobody there to help you. But there was an act passed called the Fair Treatment Standard Act. It was around 1985, which would make these things mandatory. It would make it mandatory for the DA to give you information about the justice system to give you information about where you can go for help. Nobody knows, I'm sure very few people know about the Crime Victims Board when they become victims. That's an organization, the only organization that can compensate you dollar-wise for any medical injuries you had, or if you need psychological help, or if you need to pay for your funeral, or if you need to attend court and you don't have the money. It's the best-kept secret in New York City. They don't advertise, so if the DA doesn't tell you about it, you don't know that exists. All of this information should have been handed out according to this fair treatment standard, but it's not. And the problem with this fair treatment standard is there's no way to enact it. It has no legal teeth. So, yes, it should be done, and I'm very much for it. And this is one of the things the constitutional amendment will make mandatory, that this kind of information will be given out to victims. So that's why we're supporting that. Yes?
Well, I just wanted to add to that the organization, as a defendant is handed Miranda, is given his Miranda rights, then the victim should be handed a card, or the victim's family should be handed a card listing all the.
They have that in New Jersey, by the way.
Not in New York.
No, in New Jersey they have it. It's a simple little plastic card that the police carry. And on one side it's the Miranda rights that they read to the criminal, and on the other side it's a list of victims' agencies, a list of where to go for material and where to go for help, legal and otherwise. And they give, one side is read to the criminal, and when they see the victim or they have to break some bad news or whatever, they give that card, which I think is wonderful. So we brought that up in our committee, and that's one of the things we're trying to institute right now. It's a beginning, but then, then the police could get too busy to do that too. So there still has to be some legal teeth in all of this. Yes?
You mentioned being a little ambivalent about having cameras in the courtrooms. Do you think there's a benefit in terms of letting more people see how victims are treated in court through cameras?
Well, my first feeling about that was exactly that. When we went up to Albany to argue the issue, we felt the cameras would be important because it gives the public a bird's eye view of what goes on in our courts, the good and the bad. It also gives people kind of a feeling about what it's like to be on a jury. Maybe even gives people a feeling about how much smoke screening goes on, and that when you're in a courtroom, it really has very little to do with justice or the truth. So I thought that would be a very educational process for the public to see. But to tell you the truth, I've been watching these trials, and I'm very agitated by first of all, by being hooked into it, but this is what I have to do. I mean, I don't know that I'd be watching it otherwise. Maybe I would. But it's an invasion of their privacy. I feel like I'm a voyeur. I'm watching this thing, and I'm getting embarrassed for everybody, and I don't know that I want to see it, and I turn it off, then I turn it on. I don't know that it belongs in our living rooms. I don't know that it's that important. What are we really learning from this? In plain words, he didn't get an erection, he did get one. Who cares? I mean, this is like, it has nothing to do with what really happened, and I doubt that we're going to be able to have an effect on that. It's up to the jury, and I don't know how much we're actually learning from the cameras in the courtroom, what benefit they are.
But then, where do you draw the line? Would you say, well, don't let the press in either?
Well, the press has always been in. I mean, that's, First Amendment right. It's just that because of modern technology now, the cameras feel that they have a right to be in as well. But, it's already such a negatively charged atmosphere. I told you, just having sketch artists stare at you while you're in there is really hard enough. But to know that you're going to be there testifying in front of 20 million people, especially on CNN across the globe, it can be very debilitating. I think it can affect people's testimony. I think that, you have a lot of grandstanding happening from the DAs and the prosecutors and the judge. I mean, Dominic Dunn's case was the perfect example. They had cameras in the courtroom for years in California. And he wrote an article for Vanity Fair about 4 years ago, I guess, when his case was over. And he talked about the judge who had a closet full of different sunglasses. And every day before he'd go out in front of the trial, because the cameras were there, he'd try on his sunglasses, and he'd, wear special ties and handkerchiefs. And the judge was a crackpot anyway, but this is, it does affect the quality of trying to reach some kind of a decision with justice, which I don't know that it helps at all. Yeah.
Since there is inequality, as you pointed out, with the prosecutor and the defendant's attorney, then I think it's to the advantage of the defendant to have the television cameras on. I'm opposed to it.
Yeah, I don't see how.
You get the President Kennedy thing. He's got the best that money can buy.
That's right.
And she has the prosecutor,
Right.
whatever the prosecutor.
Who's not doing such a great job.
No, and it's not equal. Since it's not equal, I don't think the camera should be.
Yeah, and also, I mean, once again, when I talk about people forming opinions about other people, about the victim, now you've got 20 million people forming an opinion about this victim because she wore black underwear that reached the world rather than just who's reading the newspapers. And, what for whatever reason, and certainly her name slipped out a couple of times, I've caught it, I don't know if anyone else did, she's forever scarred. And, between you and I have a feeling that he's going to get off, and she's going to have to try to rebuild her life with her daughter, and it's not going to be easy. So I don't really know what benefit it is to 20 million people to see what underwear she was wearing. It bothers me. Any other questions? Well, okay. Thank you all very much.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.